Hey everyone, I'm Dan Sege from Hydro Ottawa, and I'll be hosting the ThinkEnergy podcast. So here's today's big question. Are you looking to better understand the fast-changing world of energy? Join me every 2 weeks and get a unique perspective from industry leaders as we deep dive and discuss some of the coolest trends, emerging technologies, and latest innovations that drive the energy sector. So stay tuned as we explore some traditional and some quirky facets of this industry. This is the ThinkEnergy podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to the ThinkEnergy podcast. Once upon a time, we all recognize those four little words, don't we? It means a story is about to begin. Telling stories is one of the most powerful means that leaders and brands have to influence and inspire. But why? For starters, storytelling forges connections between people and ideas and experiences. What if I told you that we think and talk in stories? When I heard our guest today say this, I had one of those Oprah's aha moments. Storytelling is a distinctive human trait, and as our guest says, it's hardwired into our DNA. Stories do more than create a sense of connection, though. They build familiarity and trust across the human experience, no matter who you are and where you're from. We remember stories. Our brain chooses the information it wants and remembers that information usually because of an emotional connection a story has made. As humans, we are logical and creative beings that utilize both the left and the right side of the brain. And this is why we respond and remember great stories. Stories help us pass down knowledge, lessons, and shape our perspective of the world by understanding our place in it. So let's begin with today's big question. The energy sector is often misunderstood. I've heard this from many of my colleagues and peers. So I wonder, are we not using effective storytelling techniques to connect customers to our work, our purpose, and our people? As energy sector communicators, how can we improve our storytelling? Joining us today, I have the founder and CEO of Sea Change Institute. She has served as research director at the USC Norman Lear Center, lectures regularly on transformational media and psychology of sustainability, and received her PhD in social ecology. Dear listeners, I'm honored to present to you Dr. Beth Karlin. You have a fascinating connection and background to nature, energy, and film. Can you begin by telling us a bit more about you and what you do?
Sure. So I run a small research institute called Sea Change, where I'm based in Los Angeles, but we actually have staff on 3 continents and in 6 states in the United States. And we focus on studying and leveraging behavioral insights to solve pressing global and social issues. We work primarily, but not exclusively, on environment and climate change issues. We also work in we dabble in genocide and science learning and social injustice and food justice. But really, what we really are interested in is how we can marry ancient principles that are as old as us about how we respond and interact with each other as humans with new and changing technologies such as media, film, virtual reality. And my interest in those came, I think, from a few different places. One, just being a person that grew up reading stories and understanding and feeling the power of story. And I also lived in Los Angeles. And while I was doing my PhD, I was based here and kept looking at documentary films come out. I worked with, I had some close friends at a company called Participant Media, and they were mapping every film. They were creating a social action campaign designed to take that story and engage people. And I thought they were doing a lot right. And I kept thinking there's probably things we could learn from the sciences. So I started wanting to pull those links together. What can storytelling inform science and science inform storytelling? And then both inform kind of practice and environmentalism. And so those started in some ways as parallel tracks. I did media work and I did energy and environment work. And then the more I go along, the more they kind of keep coming together, and I keep finding more and more projects where I'm looking at a virtual reality piece with Frontline about melting glaciers in Greenland, or working on a documentary film about straws being screened to children in Los Angeles, and places even within our energy space, that programs like Power's home energy reports are not sexy like Titanic, but there's a narrative embedded in them. So to keep finding ways that understanding and being able to leverage storytelling can make us better at any form of communication, whether or not we're James Cameron.
Everyone can recognize when they've read, heard, or watched a good story, but not everyone can replicate it. What are the bones to a good story? And do the bones change based on the medium or the audience?
That's a good question. And I'm going to kind of add even more kind of varying, more yes ands. They change based on the medium, on the audience, on the time, on the messenger, on the length, on the distribution channel. I like to think about, in some ways, telling a good story is like cooking a good meal. There's an infinite variety. And the thing is, yes, we can recognize when we've read, heard, or watched a good story, but that's for us. A good story to one person is a snooze fest for somebody else. There are films that have changed my life that other people didn't enjoy, and vice versa. And so just like there's some dish that I think is great and somebody else said, too salty. And so really we're tapping into something. You're tapping into an experience when you cook a meal, when you tell a story. And the bones are tapping into that, are tapping into emotion, and not our taste buds, but our emotions, right? So if there are bones, they're tonal, right? They're making people feel things, feel good, feel bad, feel angry, and then if possible, feel different things. The best stories are ones that are not one note, like a song, like a meal. And then within that, like cooking, within that, there's just an infinite variety of ways with which to tell a good story. I don't want to say, there's Aristotelian story structure or the hero's journey, and those are great story structures. They are by no means the only way. There are models out there. We should learn from them, and we should evolve from them. And the story that resonates most closely with you and to you probably will resonate with and to someone else.
I find this fascinating. Based on cave drawings and hieroglyphics, storytelling is clearly in our DNA, as you say. What is it about our brain that storytelling creates such a profound emotional response? What is it triggering us inside?
Yeah, we actually know a lot more about that than we ever have before, because there are brain scientists that are studying how people's brains respond to stories. And there's a few things that actually happens in our brains when we hear or tell a story. So one of them is there's an increase when we hear a story, especially when we see a story, depending when we're watching film. There's all this cortex activity. A video can stimulate our visual cortex, our auditory cortex, our Broca's area, which is language processing. I'm kind of moving right now. Our motor cortex, if we're watching an action or a race scene, our sensory cortex and cerebellum. So there's all this neural activity going on. So we're really lit up on fire. And then there's a few other things we see when we're seeing a story about other people. Our mirror neurons. We actually mirror. So we feel when we're watching something with sadness, we feel sad. We see this neural coupling that stories can activate parts of our brain that allow us to kind of feel that story as if it was us. And so there's this emotional response that increases potentially our likelihood to respond. There's also, and if you think about if you or any listeners ever binge watched a Netflix series in a short amount of time when they had to work the next morning, we see dopamine release. Stories really feed us. Like they kick us into this, I want more. They're sweet, it's sugary, there's syrup for our brain. And so once we're into a storyline, we can take in the information. I think about like Orange is the New Black and how that story was so compelling. And I happened to get very engaged in prison reform and understanding all these things about how unfair prisons were. That it wasn't why I started watching season 1. And Genji really, they ramped their way up towards the end, having a lot of compelling social issues in there, that the dopamine got us into the story and into the characters and those mirror neurons, the fact that we then began caring about the issue. So, so those are a few of the things, and then the last one is this kind of combination of two chemicals, which are cortisol and oxytocin. A cortisol response is kind of a stress response. When you're watching a movie and you're at the edge of your seat and you're uncomfortable, it's literally provoking a cortisol response. And then if you've been sucked in and care through those mirror neurons about the characters, then that oxytocin, that caring chemical, will help you increase your likelihood to actually take action. So when we see this kind of cocktail of neural activity, we can see that we've been teed up like a volleyball game, and then some carefully placed call to action, if it doesn't piss people off or feel inappropriate, can really tip people into doing something.
As energy sector communicators, we're always looking to improve our stories. I saw a webinar you gave last year where you touched on 3 thoughts for good storytelling. Can you share them with us today?
Yeah. So first of all, one of the things that I think helps tell a story is setting people up, setting expectations. So I had to look up, and I'm not sure exactly which talk, because I do 3 thoughts or 5 things quite a lot, because that is a storytelling strategy, right? To go, I have 3 things I'm going to set you up today and find a path through. So if I don't hit on the exact 3 that you saw in that webinar, that is in itself a mechanism, right? Having a structure, finding a container, having a story arc. So that is one of these kind of strategies or things that when you're telling a story, when anybody's pitching a show here in Hollywood, they always storyboard it, right? Where's the beginning, the middle, and the end, right? Where's the rising crisis? What's the climax? And where's the denouement? So finding that pacing is one of these kind of ideas, and that is one of them. There's always a story, and stories have structures. So finding that story structure, there is the beginning, middle, end. There's that rising action Aristotelian structure. There's the hero's journey. There's one that I love, Nancy Duarte, who trained a lot of TED speakers, gave a talk on the secret structure of successful TED Talks. And she talks about rising action and falling action, that you move between, that a good story structure when you're trying to compel people or talk about an issue is to go between what is the current state and what could be. Like Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Here's where we could be. It may be like this now, but it could be, and up and down and up and down. And then at the end, at an upswing, you say, and here's the call to action. Here's what we do. So one is that stories have structures, and there's multiple different structures that you can use, but don't be bound by them. Another is just that there's always a story. The way our brains work is as Joan Didion says, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. So in our brains, when you're talking, somebody is actually processing it narratively. And if you don't give them a story, then they might be telling themselves a story, which is, this guy's boring. I wonder what's for dinner tonight, right? So provide that story. There is one. And there's stories even in the way we frame word for word sentences. There's a story implicit in how we ask a question, right? If you ever heard that trick question of, when did you stop beating your wife? There's a story there, right? There's always a story in how we frame something. And so we can recognize that. Another one is less is always more. We always want to go on and on. I talk about this, and I'm guilty, right? I could talk for days about pretty much anything or nothing. But we want to get to that point. A project that I worked with and I learned so much from in my doctoral studies was the Story of Stuff project. It was started by a woman named Annie Leonard, who was giving talks on why we need a paradigm shift with our relationship to the material goods economy. And she felt very strongly about that we really did need a paradigm shift with our relationship to the material goods economy. But by the time she got finished saying that we need a paradigm shift with our relationship to the material goods economy, most people were asleep. So she changed it to the story of stuff. And it kind of says the same thing. We need to understand and change the story of our stuff. So how do we pull in so that we're not bleeding words all over the place? And then the last one is it's not a one-way street, that we think of storytelling as unidirectional, that we're broadcasting, I tell and you listen. But Henry Jenkins, professor I used to work with at the University of Southern California in the Annenberg School, talks about participatory cultures, that we are, especially now more than ever in this changing technological ecosystem, people don't want to be talked at anymore, right? That we're not passive participants, right? We are interacting and engaging with stories via social media channels, online, directly to each other. And so embracing that and working that in. Make sure that when you're telling a story, you're telling a story with, not to people.
Beth, you said that storytelling has to matter if it's to drive social change. And there was something that you said that resonated with me, which was to make the audience the hero of your story and the call to action theirs. I love this. Can you talk to us about this and how it's done?
Yeah, I think a lot of, and it doesn't have, it's not binary. It doesn't have to be yours or theirs. It can be yours and theirs. I think some of the most successful stories I've seen is somebody saying, there was this thing happening. And if you are telling a story about something you did, I got involved, join me. Move from I to we to us to you as quickly as possible. Give your story away. I saw that another organization I learned so much from, and I spent a number of years working with, was called Invisible Children. And they were at first kind of almost off the radar, small nonprofit organization started by three young men who went to Africa to make a movie about genocide. And they, at the very end, instead of, when the credits were set to roll, instead of just rolling credits, they said, "This story's not over. We're not going to stop, and neither are you. We want your time, talent, and money. This is not okay, what's happening. Where you live shouldn't determine whether you live. You are going." They didn't say, we'd like you to. They said, you are going to join us. They made it very clear. And I remember the first time I watched that, I thought, yeah, I am. They made people feel like I'm a part of this. And through the growth of the organization, you saw, like 3 years after that, they did these collective events where they'd have young people, all people of all age, but largely young people, on the same day, co-located in different parts of the country, doing these large scale activations. And there was a young woman, Natalie Warren, who was in Chicago, not affiliated wasn't one of the core organizers, and decided they were going to surround Harpo Studios and get in until Oprah put the story on her show. And they did it for 3 days and 3 nights. They slept out there, and she finally did. And Natalie, after that, became more heavily involved in the organization. But Jason, Bobby, and Laren had to make Natalie feel like this Invisible Children is your organization. Don't write us a check and wait for us to change the world. You change the world. This is our story. This is our world. And so the more you do that, the more you empower people, give away your story, share it, the more you let it be so much larger than if you're just asking for people to support your vision and your efforts.
Okay, Beth, can you tell us about false memory recall and the importance of every single word in your story? When is it a good time to use this technique, or is there a good time?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't say it's so much controversial whether it's a technique to use. I think it's something to be aware of. One of the very first, and it can be used, but it's controversial. One of the very first studies that got me interested in going into psychology, and specifically going to study at University of California, Irvine, where I went, was Beth Loftus, who was and still is a professor there, was the pioneer of this research. And one of her earliest studies was on how the replacement of an indefinite with a definite article increased false memory recall. And what they found was that when you asked people, did you see the red car? People were more likely to have seen a red car than if you had asked, did you see a red car? Because when you say you're asking a different question. You're saying, there was a red car there, did you see it? If you ask, did you see a red car? I don't know if there was one, I'm asking you. And so they've found in subsequent studies and real world applied settings that slight shift can change how witnesses respond at the scene of a crime. Now, I don't know if we should use this. I think we should be aware of it, right? It's arguably been misused, right? Because with this tool, one could move people in a direction. There are some folks that said you can actually, there are positives. You could convince your child that they really liked eating lima beans and get them to like eating lima beans more. I mean, we can do this. I don't know if it's so much that we want to be leveraging this. I think we need to be aware of it, aware that every word literally matters without being overwhelmed by it. either. Because if you get, if you think about planning a 2-hour film or a 6-month campaign with multimedia and Facebook and, energy reports and bills, you could be over every word matters. Oh, and then I go, don't forget about the pictures. No, kill me now. So let's be aware of it. Let's not be overwhelmed by it, and let's make choices. But just know when you're not making choices, you're still making choices.
Okay, something about mind share now. I've read that goldfish have the attention span of 8 seconds. And you mentioned that we have, as humans, 8 seconds to hook someone. What are the steps to do that effectively?
Yeah. So first of all, just to be clear, the 8 seconds is not a scientifically proven thing.
No.
I just threw a number in there. Again, another strategy, but we have a short amount of time, right? We often say, we talk about the elevator pitch, like 60 seconds, but people tune you out way more than 60 seconds in if you're not interesting. So there's a few ways. And again, like cooking, there's not only one, right? Ask a question. If you're in person, look someone in the eye, right? There's a lot of ways you can hook someone without your words. There's your tone of voice. There's the way that your body is positioned if you're in a room, right? A pause can draw people in. There's space, not just words. An anecdote, right? If you think about, we've all read newspaper or magazine articles, there's tons of ways to hook. But typically, it's something that draws some sort of connective tissue between the person speaking and the person listening and the audience. And if you recognize, like I said earlier, that that's not one way, right? That you're establishing a mutual connection, that's the best way to hook. There's, of course, the BuzzFeed, like, I'm going to tell you, tonight at 10, 8 things that can kill you. Only 4 of them are green, humor's another one. So there are tactics. You can learn them, you can practice them, but really, I think it drills down to tapping into something, to an emotion and to a connection.
Okay, you say that stories about social change marry behavioral science theory and empirical methods. How does that influence the story and whether people take action or not?
Yeah. So look, this is also kind of controversial, like this idea of sciencing art, right? I would never wish to live in a world where somebody who was sponsoring or what's that word? Supporting Picasso's art, when he was painting Guernica, said, research says more red, put more red, it'll serve as a better protest, right? Like, I think there's a place where art should be art. And if that painting was released and somebody said, where and how do we put it and share it with the world in a way that will support and engage people to take action, I do think we could develop a curriculum around it if we wanted, in this modern day and age, to use Guernica to teach children about war, right? So we need to be very careful. I think there's I wouldn't want us to reduce art to science. I would say, if you're interested in, there is a science of evoking emotion. You can look at that. Really good storytellers don't need to follow that science. Also, if your goal is to move people from affect, from feeling something, to action, then maybe you do want to tap a little more into the behavior change science, because it's very likely that people can feel something very strongly and then not act. And so if your goal, and a lot of artists' goal, is to evoke, and that serves a very important role in the ecosystem. If you are that artist, don't do, but necessarily, if you want to move people, if you want a response, and maybe somebody picks up that story and someone else builds around it. I also know some of my favorite storytellers in the world. I was at a talk recently with Taika Waititi talking about his new film, Jojo Rabbit. And he said, do test screenings. I test my film. I test like crazy. He said he tested wildebeest so many times in New Zealand that he ran out of humans. And the last test screening was like one guy who was like somebody's friend's cousin's, like brother's uncle. And he was just kind of watching him see if he laughed, So you can test yourself crazy. The question is, are you committed to having a certain outcome? And are you willing to compromise your vision in service of that outcome? And if the answer is yes, then there's ways that you can develop hypotheses, that you can watch how people respond and then pivot and see if that improves. If that threatens or offends your artistic vision, then just don't.
Okay, Beth, you alluded to this earlier. So, wondering if you could expand on what you mean when you say that a story isn't a one-way street.
Yeah. So yeah, this was one of kind of my three thoughts on storytelling. I like is that we're bi-directional. It's getting increasingly difficult to tell stories at people. We're not interested in it anymore. And there was a period of time when we were, but Jonah Sachs wrote a book called Winning the Story Wars. Jonah is the founder of Free Range Studios, which actually with Annie and Story of Stuff Project created Story of Stuff. And they do a lot of social media. And he talks about that we came from an oral storytelling tradition. And in the oral storytelling tradition, storytelling was shared. It was around a campfire. It was always communal. It wasn't broadcast. And that we moved into, once we started developing the parchment and paper and the printing press and radio and television, that we started having, one person tell a story out. And that is a period of time that has gone for quite a while. And he talks about this current era as the digitoral era, that we've now moved past broadcast into digitally recreating that fire circle, except it's much larger, right? We can all kind of participate. And another thing I mentioned him before that Henry Jenkins says, I might have said this exact thing, that producers may be afraid of losing control over their narratives. But the truth is, you've already lost control. You embrace, right? You can control your channel, but you can't stop people from talking. So you can't control people so if you are a media organization and you turn off your chat function, that doesn't stop people from talking. It just makes them mad and they get louder elsewhere. It's like a whack-a-mole, right? So we need to embrace that this is the world we live in. We're in a long tail world where there's more ways for people to communicate writ large. Voices can get lost, but there's a lot of them. And so recognizing that and don't work around it, embrace it, pull people in, because the best way to get someone to listen to you is to listen to them. And the best way to get somebody to care is to listen to them. And the best way to fill in the blank is to listen to them.
I've mentioned that the energy sector is misunderstood. It's big, it's confusing, and there's a lot of characters. I think it's why we've struggled to tell our stories. A lot of people don't understand the energy world. You've talked about the importance of creating worlds for audiences. What can the energy sector do to better convey our world?
Great question. And I think it really ties into what we were just talking about with one-way versus two-way communication. I would say we don't. Let's live in their world. Their world is hot pizza and cold beer, and it's comfortable kids in bed at night, right? And start from there and then pull it back to energy. I want security, I want safety, I want bills down, right? Like I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know if I really understand how electricity works. And I definitely don't understand how photovoltaic panels work, yet I worked on solar technology for the US government, right? What I understand is what it takes to get somebody to care enough to put it on their roof. And I'm not saying I understand everything about that, but in the seat where I sit, I don't need to understand the full world of energy. I think we want, especially when we're specialists and engineers, we want people to understand stuff. But maybe you just want them to do a thing. And so to do that, again, it depends on what your goal is. If our goal is energy literacy, I've met with very few people in the energy space that when I really push, when I get them back, when I get the why down to the why, down to the why, down to the why, is really I want people to understand kilowatt hours. It's usually I want people to use less or use differently or shift their times. Right? And if that's the goal, get in their world. Get in it, live in it, swim in it, understand it. And don't ask them to do anything that doesn't fit into it. And if you do, make sure that you have a reason and you have a workaround. Live in their world. Start there. And if you don't make your way back to your world, but you've made your way towards your goal, consider that a success.
Now, what about technology and social media? Are they changing how people interact with all industries, including the energy sector? Do you see a transformation in the way stories are made or designed?
Yeah, this is constantly changing. So the way that we're telling stories is evolving quickly. Um, it's not new though. All these concerns that people have about Facebook and video games and VR and television is making us stupid and video games are making us violent. Any new technology, people had huge concerns around the printing press and what that would do, how that would destroy the fabric of society, right? So for good and for bad, the way we tell stories and the way we're interacting is changing. And that is not right or wrong. It is. Some of the ways it's changing now, and then in this exact moment, and I know people might listen to this at many points in time, but this exact moment, we're talking in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and we're in our homes under government order, and I think that's changing the way that we're thinking about telling stories and engaging and sharing and receiving information in ways that are could have potential long-term positive implications. That people are in these kind of Zoom chat rooms doing breakout groups and being more interactive. I'm seeing more people who waited until it was a holiday to get the family together are now getting together with people all over the country and world on a regular basis and realizing, oh my gosh, for the past 10 years, we only talked on Thanksgiving. We only saw grandma 4 times a year, and now we're talking every Saturday, right? So is that storytelling? No. Does that have implications for how we're sharing and connecting and giving information? Of course it does. I think we're going online more. People are getting more interested in more immersive forms of storytelling and being virtually present. And we don't know how that's going to eventually fall. And it's not about predicting it. It's about becoming it. It's about creating. We have these opportunities to continue. And then with social media, I think the biggest one is the thing I was talking about earlier multiple times, is this increase in bidirectional communication, that you can't just talk at and then just shut the floodgates and not let people talk back in, right? And so we're not needing to, we're getting to adapt to that. If you think you have to adapt to it, you're missing the point. This is a huge opportunity.
In your expert opinion, do you think different generations like baby boomers or millennials seek information from different technologies? If so, how can we shape stories to better resonate with those different cohorts?
Yeah, we actually just finished last year. We were a partner and the evaluation partner of a 4-year National Science Foundation grant with PBS NewsHour, looking at that exact question. At the PBS NewsHour audience was closer, more boomers and less millennials. And so could we use different media channels? So we looked at how are different generations, and if so, how are they experiencing media self-seeking differently? And the answer is yes and no. And the cool thing is we don't have to rely solely on demographics for how people seek information. So if we had to, in general, older audiences are still watching more appointment TV, like that show that's on Sunday night, like 60 Minutes in America. I grew up, I'm not that old, I'd like to think. Like that idea of a thing at a time and a place. We also, by and large, tolerate longer content than younger. And there's individual level difference, right? My mother uses Bitmojis and I don't. She is on social media more than I am, right? So we're seeing differences. If you really are interested in understanding who is most likely to go to a Barry Manilow concert, you might say men, white, these regions over 60. But really, if you wanted to find those people, what's better than demographics is who likes Barry Manilow on Facebook. So the truth is there are demographic differences, but we don't need to use them as much as we used to. We don't need to chunk people anymore. We're able to kind of look for, and if you're not a Barry Manilow fan on Facebook, if you're friends, not just Facebook friends, but if you've been tagged in a photo with somebody who is, because that shows that we have a real place-based relationship, not just we met on a bus and liked somebody. That predicts your interests. So while yes, there are generational differences, we can use them. They're rough. And underneath them now, with all this data, we can look at other differences that might be more salient even.
Wow. Never thought a Barry Manilow reference would make it on my podcast. Beth, how about we close off with rapid fire questions? Are you ready?
I think so.
What is your favorite word?
It's maybe a little self-serving, because I think I could describe myself this way. It's loquacious.
What is one thing you can't live without?
Oh gosh, so cheesy. Love.
What is something that challenges you?
Procrastination, my own desire to do nothing more than anything most of the time.
What's a good book you've read or movie you've seen recently where the story made a lasting impression?
One of my favorite movies I've seen, I don't know how, it might have been a year or two ago, but I revisit it, is Captain Fantastic. It sounds like a Marvel movie, but it's not. And I thought it was tonally beautiful. It was about a family, but it was also about society and how are we to live if we can't go back to caves, nor do we want to? How do we live in this world in a way that still resonates with who we want to be to each other? And it's also just sad and hilarious. Talking about going back to the beginning, talking about ups and downs. I laughed, I cried, I tore my hair out. It's just lovely.
If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
I always think about that invisibility versus flying. I'm an invisibility girl.
If you could turn back the time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you tell her?
I would tell her, you're perfect. It's going to be okay. And stop trying to lose weight so much and enjoy yourself.
And lastly, what do you currently find most interesting in the energy sector?
Yeah, I think we're in this such interesting moment in this time of transition when we're all like stuck at home, and then we're going to be going out again. That looking at micro generation and distributed grids and how we can really think at the local level a little more, but connecting locals into a larger system and take this opportunity to really think about what local community energy looks like, not as an enemy to the large industrial complex, but as a complement to.
Well, Beth, we've reached the end of another episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. Last question for you. How can our listeners learn more about you? How can they connect?
Yeah, so you can find me. I will warn you, I can't remember the last time I updated my website, but you can find me personally at bethkarlin.com. But Sea Change is at seachangeinstitute.org. And both of those websites have a contact page. I'm not very fast at email, but I really do try to reach out. I'm willing to chat with folks. I'm happy. I love this stuff. I'm happy to take a 15 to 30 minute meeting with almost anybody who has good intentions. So feel free to reach out. I would be more than happy to chat with anybody.
Thank you for joining us today. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. For past episodes, make sure you visit our website, hydroottawa.com/podcasts. Lastly, if you found value in this podcast, be sure to subscribe. Anyway, this podcast is a wrap. Cheers, everyone.